the session now. So one of the things I want to show you, another major book on this subject is called Does the Soul Survive by Rabbi Eli Spitz, and it's in the bibliography. And a lot of the material that I'm going to be quoting from this evening is from that book. So if you want to get back to the source of that, I highly recommend his book. So you can see at the bottom of the page, I have the page numbers referenced. So basically, a soul is understood as an extension of the godlike nature within us. One of the things I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but I always like to think of the idea that we are created. God says, "Let us create humanity in our image." And the traditional Christian, the question arises: who is God talking to? In speaking in the first person plural, a traditional Christian answer will be triune self. God is Trinity. Traditional Jewish answer is God was speaking to the angels, and an answer that's modern that I like is God was speaking to the animals. So we have an animal nature and we have a divine nature. So generally speaking, in this literature, the soul seems to be an extension of God. So back to the Bible, it says God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground, and we have a pun in the Hebrew. Adamah is the dust, and it's related to the word Adam, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath, the neshama of life, and Adam thus became a living creature. In Hebrew, there are three terms used for breath: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. These are used in Jewish mystical tradition to describe the soul. One of the really interesting things, and those of you who have studied with me know I keep coming back to this idea over and over again, that Hebrew is a very flexible language and words have a wide range of meaning. One of the interesting elements of this is that sometimes in the a word, and we'll see this, that may have the meaning, let's say nefesh, which just means a living being in the Bible. That word nefesh will in Talmud and mystical literature mean soul rather than just a living entity. So, and the words are related. The idea of the breath conveys the idea that the soul is intangible, animates life, and links to God. And by the way, it says God breathed into Adam the breath of life. So that leads to the traditional Jewish teaching that life begins when the baby is born and draws its first breath. And traditionally, life ends with the cessation of breathing. Certainly that's distinct with respect to other religious traditions. So the Zohar, and I'm going to talk more about mysticism, but the central text of Jewish mysticism is called the Zohar, has a description of three dimensions of the soul. Although it's one unified soul, they talk about different levels or different aspects of the soul. So nefesh is at the most primary level of human existence, representing action and physical pleasure. Ruach is in the realm of feelings. The Hebrew word ruach in modern Hebrew means spirit. You might talk about a class or a team that has lots of ruach. As applied to the soul here, it's the realm of feelings, which enables personality and the expression of love. Animals have souls corresponding to these two levels, nefesh and ruach. And then as we get to higher levels, we have neshama, which is associated uniquely with human capacities: analytical thought, the quest for meaning, and transcendence. Oops, I lost one earbud. This is the living soul, nishmat chaim, that God breathes into Adam in Genesis. And then Isaac Luria, the Ari of Sfat, who is one of the masters of mysticism, identifies two more levels of the soul, chaya and yechida, linked together, forming a fourth dimension of creation and might be called spirit. And there is a beautiful image. Whoops, let's just see about this in a couple of places. So in the Talmud, we read that as God fills the whole world, so the soul fills the whole body. As God sees but cannot be seen, so the soul sees and cannot be seen. As God nourishes the whole world, so the soul nourishes the whole body. As God is pure, so also the soul is pure. As God dwells in the innermost part of the universe, so also the soul dwells in the innermost part of the body. So it's a sense, the soul is sort of God's representative. I like to think of it as the divine element in your personhood. And one of our prayers is, it's in a morning liturgy, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. The soul you have given me is pure. And some scholars believe that that prayer entered the liturgy as a sort of a subtle response to the idea of original sin. And Bill, maybe you can comment on the idea, is original sin something that stains your soul per se in Catholic thought? Bill, you're muted. Now you're not.
Is it, I don't know if I know enough about it, Mike.
Okay.
A lot of what we understand from original sin comes from Augustine of Hippo.
Okay.
And not to say that this is Catholic doctrine, but Augustine understood that original sin is passed on biologically through the carnal act.
Right, a sexually transmitted disease.
If you will.
Yes. So anyway, some scholars believe that prayer was a way of saying we don't hold with the idea of original sin. Our soul at birth is pure, and yes, we can screw things up, but the soul that we were given with is pure. This is a beautiful image that I love, and it's based on Chaim Vital, who is one of Isaac Luria's students. And he talks about the image of a glass blower. Everybody, understand what a glass blower does, a blob of glass molten and in a long pipe. And to blow glass requires the glass blower to blow in deeply. I think he's actually talking about breathe in deeply and get a breath, and then exhale through the tube. As the breath moves through the glass, it expands and shapes it. When the work is completed, the breath still rests on the glass. So the breath on the glass is the nefesh, what you inhale and what you blow, the most basic level of life force in all living things. The ruach, next level of the soul, is the wind. It's the force that blows through the glass, giving it its shape. The neshama is the outward breath of the glass blower, powering the wind. The chaya is the inward breath. And the yechida, the highest, is the soul of the glass blower. I don't know if that's helpful or confusing, but I like it. It sort of talks about a hierarchy of elements to the soul. So this is one of the chief disciples of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the founder of Hasidic Judaism. So he says, when a man is born, he has only an animal soul, the nefesh. When he overcomes the evil urge, physical compunction, such as the craving for food or sex, the person is given a ruach. The entire world of angels is then in his domain. If the person is even more worthy and he learns to master his emotions, such as anger, he is given a neshama, corresponding to the divine throne. This means that his every intent and thought creates a throne for God. When a person at this level thinks about his love of God, he's placed in the universe of love. Such a person must never remove his thoughts from God, even for an instant, for God himself rests in his thoughts. And again, so here's Hasidic Judaism, and it definitely has its own particular take on souls and animal souls and human souls. And I'm pretty sure in the Hasidic world, there's a discussion that the souls of Jews are different than the souls of non-Jews. But that isn't necessarily true of what other branches of Judaism would teach, and even other Hasidic branches and even other Orthodox, or maybe other Hasidic branches would teach the same thing, but not necessarily other Orthodox. Remember, once again, we're going to be exposed to lots of teachings and thinking on this, but there is no orthodoxy in what you must believe about this.
Michael?
Yes.
The word nefesh is translated to soul here?
Yeah, so what we have is a number of words are translated into soul because there's a hierarchy. So we have nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. And they're all higher and higher levels of soul.
Okay.
But I think in the Bible, nefesh is simply a translation of a living being. You may be more expert on that than I. It would be, again, very interesting to see how this gets translated into Greek, but that's a subject of another class.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Okay. Yes, okay. So Rabbi Spitz, in this book, Does the Soul Survive?, compares the multiple levels of the soul to the 4 levels of human pleasure. Physical pleasure, pursuit of comfort, security, sports, sex, music, and so on, corresponds to the nefesh. Emotional satisfaction, love of our children, spouse, best friends, corresponds to a higher level, ruach. Meaning, service to nation and community, bettering the lives of people around us, charitable act, to neshama. And then intuition, imagination, inspiration, eureka moments, intuition of oneness, peak moments, sunset, holding a newborn, holy moments, engage the 2 higher levels of the chaya and yechida dimensions of the soul. A writer I admire very much talks about the difference between happiness and fun. Take children to Disneyland and they're having fun. When you say it's time to go home, you realize that this hasn't made them happy because they're very upset when they have to go home. So just as this levels of fun leads to happiness and so on, talking about higher and higher levels of the soul. This is very important, and I would say a contrast with Christianity. In Judaism, body and soul are not disconnected or warring entities, but intertwine like lovers. Just as wine stains the flask and the flask influences the taste of the wine, so body and soul interpenetrate and are distinctive. A famous thinker, Saadia Gaon, writes, "The soul requires the good acts of the body to perfect its peculiarly immaterial celestial-like substance, even as the body needs the faculties and sensation and reason that the soul provides." So contrast this with Galatians, which is one of Paul's letters. "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." My understanding of this is a very Greek idea of the separation of body and soul. And Jews also, or Judaism is heavily influenced by Greek thought, but it's much more normative Judaism doesn't consider the body and soul to be separate. They are very much intertwined. And that's one of the reasons why in physical resurrection, your body and your soul will be joined together and judged together. And there's this really interesting story, I don't think I have it in this presentation, of the body saying, I didn't sin, it was the soul that made me sin. And the soul says, no, I didn't sin, it was the body and its urges that made me sin. They are considered to be partners in Judaism.
Mike,
Mm-hmm.
In that passage from Galatians, Paul uses a Greek word sarx, which translates to flesh. So I would add that's not necessarily Paul believing in a separation of the soul and the body. He's using the word flesh there in a complex way.
Okay. And in Judaism also, they talk about basar vadam, flesh and blood.
Yeah.
And basar can also, I think it's a modern Hebrew word for meat, as in you going to a butcher. So flesh, very much the same. Okay. I want to digress to give you a brief introduction to Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah means received, meaning the received tradition. The goal of Kabbalah is to get closer to and even cleave to God. It is built on top of Judaism. It's not an alternative to Judaism, but a much deeper practice. Someone who is a Kabbalist begins with Orthodox observance and then says, how can I get even deeper and closer to God? We have these days what I would call, and many people call, pop Kabbalah. Madonna, tattoos, red strings. And I guess when I prepared this, I said, just because you wear a stethoscope doesn't make you a doctor. And I actually love to talk about the difference between magic and mystic. Magic means if I do all these strange things, like from a Jewish point of view, if I fast on Yom Kippur, if I keep strictly kosher, if I say prayers 3 times a day, if I keep my head covered with this funny little hat and put on tefillin in the morning and do all these things, magic would say, if I do all those things, I can get God to do my will. The mystic would have the same list of things and more, but the goal of the mystic would not be to get God to do the mystic's will, but to get the mystic to do God's will. So that's an important difference. So to give you an idea of how Jewish mysticism works,
that makes it sound a little bit more like Islam, where one is giving over to God.
Well, what I would say is, I would say, yes, there is an element of Islam, and certainly mysticism develops later in the same time that Islam is developing. And one of the reasons why I am not an honest-to-God Kabbalist is I can't accept those ideas about completely surrendering your will to God. But that is absolutely mysticism, as I understand it, is the idea that your goal is to get your will to be identical to God's will. Now, of course, you have freedom of choice there, so it's an interesting nuance. But there's also a mystical idea, and I don't remember if I have it in this kind of brief overview, that everything is exactly the way God intends it to be. And that's very nice, when you win the lottery, but also it's true when your house burns down and, when you've lost someone you've loved. And that's another reason why I can't become an honest-to-God practicing mystic. I don't know if that clarifies any. And your microphone is muted, I think. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the way mysticism works. One of the way mysticism works in Judaism is always by focusing on text. 95 times out of 100, Jewish spirituality derives from focusing on revelation, on scripture. So there's a very well-known verse for Jews, and I would say for non-Jews, which is Deuteronomy 6:4, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai Echad. And so as you see in this little table, there's lots of different ways to translate the word Echad. Adonai alone, Adonai is one indivisible, unique, ultimate, unity, or everything. And the Hebrew can encompass everything. And there's even more, which we're not going to talk about, because traditionally the way the scroll is written, this letter and this letter are written large, and we derive all sorts of interesting meanings from that. So I have a book on my bookshelf behind me called The Meanings of Echad. And so that's that word. The very last word in the Shema is Echad, which means one. But as we'll see, different rabbis, different scholars can interpret that word in many ways. So in this book, there are 25 essays on the meaning of the word Echad. And one major issue is about the nature of God. So I usually do this when I have people in a room and I can see at least 3 of you. So when I count to 3, point to God. 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's a little hard to see where you are pointing. Usually, people will kind of point, do this. People will point up. People will point internally. A couple of you, I can't see it all, so I'm not sure where you pointed. But I want to point out that there are two valid Jewish models of God. The first one is the conventional rational model. And the idea here is God is over here, up there, and I'm down here. God's in heaven, and I'm on earth. This model is reflected in all of our blessings, which always begin with, blessed are you, Adonai. Once we say, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, then there's a you, namely God, and there's a me, namely me. And by the way, I always think of the word you in this blessing as one of the most spiritual words in Judaism. Because whenever you say a blessing, I drink water, there's a blessing for water. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh bidvaro. I have brought myself into conversation with God. So it's a very spiritual act, the idea that you're remembering God in all the mundane acts of life. So that's model number one, conventional, rational. There's nothing wrong with it. My guess is this would be the model of Maimonides, if I had to guess. Model number two is, I would say, mystical or Kabbalist. In this image, God is everywhere and everything. There's a boundary here, but it's indicated by dashes. And my separation from God is an illusion, also indicated by dashes. So we think we're separate from God, but that's an illusion. When you look at a wave, and I know Dr. Charles is also the master of waves, being a dedicated surfer. When you look at a wave looks like a separate thing from the ocean. It has shape, it has form, it has substance. But of course, a wave is part of the ocean. The separation is an illusion. One of my teachers, Larry Kushner, will talk about trees. And he say, we, biologists, we humans give names to the different parts of the trees. So there's a leaf and a twig and a branch and the trunk and the roots and the extensions of the root, from big roots down to fine roots. And we, being biologists, can give names to these things, but the tree doesn't know where the twig ends and the branch begins and where the branch ends and the tree begins. It's all one unitary tree. So I would say one of the central insights in mysticism and Kabbalah is that when we say Adonai Echad, God, what we're really saying is God is unity. Everything is God. And the distinctions between us, between me and this microphone, are illusions, that really God is the connective tissue of everything in the universe. And it goes on to say, and I have problems with this, that everything is going exactly the way God intends it to go. I have huge problems with that, in terms of illness in my family and, in the Holocaust and all kinds of things. So this is not my theology at all, but it certainly is the teachings of Kabbalah as I understand it. And I think it gets very close to Islam. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I think that is a reasonable insight. So I mentioned the Zohar is the central text of Jewish mysticism. I can't remember how much I have on the Zohar. Let's see, what do I have? Yeah, I do. Okay. So the Zohar in English translation, Zohar is pretty large. This is an English translation. There's a later translation by Danny Matt. I'll talk a little bit about the Zohar. The Zohar is a work of pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is actually an English word. It turns out pseudepigrapha is the opposite of plagiarism. In plagiarism, you copy someone else's work and claim you wrote it. In pseudepigrapha, you write something and you claim somebody else wrote it. So the Zohar is written as though it were written by Shimon Bar Yochai, a second century Common Era Mishnah teacher. And it's written in the Aramaic of the period. And it's a very interesting story about a group of rabbis led by their mystical teacher, wandering through the Galilee and northern Israel. Dr. Shallows, does that remind you of anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was actually written, scholars know, in the 13th century in Spain by Moshe de Leon and possibly by his school. And we know that in the 13th century of Spain, there was enormous Catholic anti-Semitism. And in some ways, people see this as one of the animating forces in the Zohar, is to say, we had our great mystical rabbi wandering the Galilee at about the same time. We know it's actually written later because every now and again, a medieval Spanish word creeps in. And again, I don't know all of the scholarship on the subject, but I'm not aware of any scholars that actually believe it was really written by Shimon Bar Yochai. But if you ask your local Chabad rabbi, a traditional rabbi, he, and I can say he, would say that it was certainly written by Shimon Bar Yochai. And it is a mystical commentary on the Torah. So again, remember I said spirituality in Judaism starts with text. So the Zohar is going to go line by line and verse by verse through the Torah and also through the 5 scrolls, the 5 Megillot, and provide a mystical commentary. There it is. It structures a commentary on the Torah. We read of a brilliant rabbi 2,000 years ago wandering to Galilee. It provides a structure and a practice of Kabbalah. It introduces the 10 Sefirot. I will mention more about that in a minute. And it's exceedingly difficult and complex. So here's an example. I'll just read this just because I'm so in awe of the language. At the head of the potency of the king, this is actually a commentary of the moment of creation in Genesis. At the head of the potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed from the head of infinity, a cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, a thrust in a ring, not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, splaying colors below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. Ein Sof is one of the words for the ultimate description of God. It means without end or without limit. It split and did not split its aura, was not known at all until under the impact of splitting a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond that, nothing is known as called Reshit, beginning, first commandment of all. And in Danny Matt's translation, this is accompanied by 3 pages of 13 lengthy footnotes. The text, I can't remember what I have here. We'll look at the Sefirot in a second. The text of the Zohar is so complicated. There is no until a few years ago, there was no good English translation. There are literal translations, but without a lot of footnotes and explanations, it's really hard to make heads or tails of what's going on. So I don't know if you can read Danny Matt's name here, but there was a scholar of Jewish mysticism, Daniel Matt, and he had written several books about the Zohar and about some stories from the Zohar, really interesting and accessible stories. And a woman from the Pritzker family, a very wealthy, I think, Chicago family, went to him and asked him, can you tell me a good translation of the Zohar? And he said, there isn't one. And she said, well, why don't you write one? And he said, that would take me and a team of scholars the rest of my life to do. And I think then he was about in his mid-30s. And she said, great, my family will fund it. So for about the last 25 years, Daniel Matt has been coming up in about 10 volumes like this with a good English translation and commentary. It's still, this language that I just showed you is from his commentary. So it's still not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Quick question, Mike.
Yes.
This isn't the same Pritzker that just ran for and became governor of Illinois.
Yeah, it is the same.
It's probably the same family, but I don't know. I know just from hearing Danny tell the story that it was a woman that approached him, so I don't know what the connection is.
Okay. I think it's the Hyatt Hotel money, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. So one of the big innovations in the Zohar is to describe the nature of God. And a big clue in the Torah is that God created humanity in the divine image. You've heard this, right? So therefore, I always say when I teach this, I ask people to speculate, what does that tell you about God? And what does that tell you about people? When we read a text saying that we are created in the divine image, and that actually can also mean shadow. I don't think I get into that much in this discussion. So what does that mean? What does that tell us about God? What does that tell us about people? But so one of the ideas which is picked up in the Zohar is just as a person has a form and structure, so the nature of God also has a form and structure. And again, I've studied this a lot, and I'm now at the stage where I can honestly say I'm just confused by this rather than being completely bewildered. So, this is not supposed to be easy, but there's a right side and a left side. There is a crown above which a crown of God. There is a womb. So the idea is it's a flow, that you have a point which impregnates the womb and gives birth to the lower levels of the Sefirot. The word Sefirah means counting. One of the lessons I think we should draw from this is not only it's complicated, but I talk to many Jews who are put off by the idea of the Trinity in Christianity because of the idea that God is three in addition to being one. And I'll just point out that in the Kabbalah, God has 10 emanations, and they describe different elements of God. You have wisdom, understanding, love, power, beauty, eternity, splendor, foundation, which is a phallus, and then Shekhinah, which is a feminine word, which is understood as a queen. And there's a lot of discussion, which is actually quite interesting and quite sexual, about the relationship between God, masculine, and God's feminine aspects. And again, maybe one of these days we'll do an online class in Kabbalah because it's very interesting. And any quick questions or about the Sefirah? You will see this image a lot. If you buy books about Kabbalah, you will always see this image. If you see an image like this, a 10-fold image with the seven lower elements of the Sefirot corresponds to 7 days of the week, corresponds to the 7 planets that people knew about at this time, and so on. Any questions or comments? Well, just chime in if you do. So people will ask a lot about what happens to the soul after someone dies. And this is kind of a synthesis of Kabbalistic understandings following the teachings in this book that I showed you, Jewish Views of the Afterlife by Simcha Raphael. And as you can see, it covers about 50 pages of material. So, and again, you don't have to believe this, but I would say he is taking sort of an overview of what the most prevalent thread of mystical ideas are in Kabbalah about what happens to the soul after death. So the nefesh, again, the lower level, suffers the experience of the dying process, of the grave, and of separation from the physical body. And in this description, it takes 7 days to experience this separation. There's very much, you read a lot in the mystical literature of a river of light, which is sort of a pathway, as I understand it, between this world and the next world. The soul encounters angelic spirits and deceased relatives and undergoes life review. And one of the really interesting things about this, which we will discuss, I think, a lot more next week, are near-death experiences and how near-death experiences seem to track this idea. The Ruach, now higher level of the soul, experiences the cleansing of Gehenna, a time to experience and resolve unresolved emotions. And I think of it possibly post-mortem psychotherapy. I'm not sure everybody was with me last week. Gehenna is a term for where you go when you die. And that term appears in the Bible. It's not developed much in the Bible. It is developed much more in post-biblical material. So there is very much in this concept the idea that your soul, once separated from the body, goes to a place of cleansing, which would be a place of purging, which I think is not badly described by the word purgatory.
Just going to say that.
Yes, and it takes up to a year. The deceased is helped by children and others saying Kaddish for the person who has departed, and enters lower Gan Eden. Gan Eden means Garden of Eden, and that is a place you see often in the mystical literature about where do I go after I die. The answer is Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and you'll quite often see that name on cemeteries, Gan Eden, which is a world of emotional bliss where the personality is completed. And one of the things I like, I think I may have mentioned it last week, that you get off from Gehenna on Shabbat. So you're being punished and purged of your sins. In Gehenna, maximum sentence is 1 month, with some important exceptions that we'll see in a moment. And you get off on Shabbat. You're not punished. I like that. Then in the Neshama, after this 1 year, up to 1 year period, takes another dip in the river of light and enters Upper Gan Eden, the heavenly repose for the soul. The quality of your stay there depends on your focus in life. If it was very much on the physical, Upper Gan Eden won't seem like much. If it was on the spiritual, you reap the spiritual reward and experience transcendent bliss. The yearly Kaddish at the time of Yartzeit is said to elevate the soul to higher spheres annually. The sources speak of seeing God. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the word Kaddish and Yartzeit, we're going to discuss the Kaddish prayer in Aramaic, a mourner's prayer. And Yartzeit is actually from the German, a word meaning the anniversary of one's death. And in Judaism, you recite this mourner's prayer. We're going to talk about mourning practices next time. You recite the mourner's prayer daily, actually 3 times a day, in the early time of mourning. And then beyond the year, you recite it on the anniversary of someone's passing. Going up to a higher level of soul, the Chaya returns to the storehouse of souls in preparation for rebirth. If in the previous stage we see God, in this stage we are being with God in the Tzur HaChaim, the storehouse of souls, or in the bundle of life. And Raphael associates this with the morning ritual of Yizkor, which is a special service of mourning, not mourning early in the day, but mourning, mourning, that we observe in connection with 4 holidays throughout the course of the year. But again, I want to point out here, in the mystical view, we're talking about rebirth. That is, we are talking about reincarnation. The Yechida is joined with God and placed in the womb. So now we're talking about reincarnation. The soul in the womb is shown the entire world, Gan Eden, Gehenna, where it will live and where it will die. And some say the entire Torah. And when the moment of birth arrives, an angel touches the baby just beneath the nose. And I forgot the name. I think it's called philostrum. There is a little dent right under your nose. And the mystical tradition says that's why we have that dent on our nose. We have learned the entire Torah, the Talmud, everything. We have perfect insight into the entire nature of everything. The angel touches us right there, and we forget about it. The rabbis believe that the dead can communicate with both the human and the heavenly realms, and they petition for mercy on behalf of the living. They speak of the dead being on the other side of a curtain. I don't remember if I have texts on that. I don't think I have a text on that specifically, but there are stories in the Talmud about the dead, trying to let the living know whether the year will be a good year for crops and things. So there's routine. Well, I don't know if routine is the right word, but it is not unusual to read in these sources about the dead communicating with the living. And as we'll see, certainly in mystical literature And, you know, in your life and mine, I've heard examples of people communicating between worlds, and actually in the next session, I'm going to leave a fair amount of time for people to share your own stories about that, and I'll share some of my stories about that. So here are some traditions on Gehenna, this place of punishment. When you see words like Shabbat 33b or Rosh Hashanah 17a, you know that we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. So Shabbat is the tractate, page 33 on the B side of the page. There's an A side of the page and a B side of the page. So the punishment of the wicked in the Gehenna is a maximum of 12 months, but some are sent eternally. Who is sent eternally? Again, according to another place in the Talmud, heretics, one who, you know, denies the existence of God or preaches falsehoods about God, one who commits adultery with a married woman, publicly shames a neighbor, or fastens an evil epithet upon his neighbor. Baba Metzia 38b, also the Talmud. I always say, tongue strongly in cheek. It's hard for me to imagine someone who would publicly attach evil or nasty names to people. So I certainly, of course, don't know of anyone like this, but if you do know somebody like this, according to Jewish tradition, such a person may be sentenced beyond the 12 months, maybe even eternally in Gehenna. As I mentioned before, the time period is a period of purification and atonement, and then the soul enters Gan Eden. How do we reduce our time in Gehenna? By doing good things, by giving charity, sharing food for the poor, tithing money to teachers and students, and being humble. And as I mentioned, you get Shabbat off. There is also a discussion in the medieval sources about the punishment fitting the crime. So those that were vain may be punished by being hung by their hair. Those whose eyes led them to sin maybe have hooks attached to their eyes. People who were perfumed to sin may be hung by their nose. Those who slandered by their tongues. And of course, I always have to put this somewhat delicately. Those who committed adultery will be suffer other appropriate punishments. So let's move from the place of punishment to the place of reward. And by the way, I hope you're noticing many Jews will say that Judaism does not hold with the idea of heaven and hell, a place of punishment. And again, there's lots of different beliefs, but certainly Gehenna, a place of punishment, is part of normative Judaism. Heaven, Gan Eden, is a heavenly realm where the souls of the righteous reside. I meant the term Gan Eden, and actually Olam Haba, which means the world to come, is used both in Jewish sources for the existence after death. So what happens to me immediately after I die, or maybe after a year? There's a discussion of Olam Haba and Gan Eden. And the term is also used more broadly as the existence after the arrival of the Messiah. There are fantastic descriptions with gates of ruby, thousands of ministering and singing angels, white robes, crowns of gold, gems, pearls, rivers of milk, wine, and so on and so on. The tree of life bearing 500,000 varieties of fruit, and the sages expounding the Torah. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of lower and upper Gan Eden and even higher levels. The lower is a transit point. The upper level is reserved for the pious of a higher grade, and it contains yeshivot, places for Torah study. And then the highest level or higher level is the source of life, where the disembodied soul prepares for rebirth, which is reincarnation. It is, I find it especially beautiful that one of the highest occupations of reward in the next world is to study Torah with the sages of the ages. And you read about, difficult questions. They call in the Messiah to resolve questions. And then I think I've even seen sources where it said for the most difficult questions, you call in God to resolve difficult questions in Torah study.
What's interesting to me is that the Tzor HaKayim is where the soul prepares for rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
In Eastern traditions, rebirth is a way of expunging all the things one did wrong. So instead of it being a reward, it's a punishment. So this is a reversal of that concept.
So is that also along the lines of the idea? I mean, you hear in I think it's Buddhist tradition with nirvana, that you are reborn again and again, and then when you finally get it right, then you go to nirvana, which is nothingness. Is that kind of the same idea?
Yeah, except this is a reversal, so that when you have gotten to a stage of perfection and unity with God, you then are reborn. So it's a very different perception of what it means to be alive on the earth.
Yeah, but one of the things which I think I may be not giving you an accurate description of the tradition as I understand it is even someone who isn't a terrific person will be reborn. And there is this discussion of, which seemingly is inconsistent with some of the things I've been saying. So for example, the Kabbalists will address the question of why were so many innocent people murdered in the Holocaust, specifically 1.5 million innocent children. And one answer is they weren't innocent, not because of original sin, but their souls still had the sin that they committed in previous incarnations. So that seems to be different than sort of the story that I'm giving, which sounds like a car wash. You know, you go through and then you're clean, and once you're sparkling clean, you go back into the world. The reading I've done about theodicy, and that is, you know, why bad things happen to good people, is maybe they're not good, and the reason they're not good is not original sin, which would be possibly a Christian interpretation on this, but the sins that you've committed in past lives. And specific.
I'm sorry, Mike. Finish. After you finish, I'll come in on this.
Okay. So, for example, one thing I've heard several times from, typically from Hasidic Jews, is when someone dies young, it's actually an act of divine mercy. Because the idea is they had some sins they needed to work out, and so they come back into this world, and they've done a certain number of things, and now their soul is in really good shape, and God, in God's mercy, took them early so that they wouldn't have time to screw it up. This is one of the categories of Kabbalistic teachings, which my teacher, Larry Kushner, says, you don't bring within 100 meters of a hospital. Because I would never tell, and you know, and I've been in this position as a rabbi of burying, I think the youngest funeral I've conducted was for an 8-day-old baby girl, and I've conducted funerals for teenage kids. And I would never say, this was really an act of divine mercy. God took your child so they wouldn't commit any more sins. It's actually one of the reasons why that whole idea actually horrifies me. But that is part of the teaching. Yes, you were going to say.
Okay, so the variation on this that I was thinking of, and I think I heard this from Simcha Raphael a couple of years ago, I think the Kala, was that a soul goes to Gan Eden, or to Tzur HaChaim, and then if the soul has performed all 613 mitzvot, then it's done. It can go on to Gan Eden forever. Otherwise, it recycles till it's performed all the mitzvot.
Yeah, so I have no doubt that you heard that from Simcha Raphael. And again, I'll just point out, this is a big book.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of different teachings in here, which are not necessarily consistent with one another. And in fact,
and I think this was the Zohar. It was from Matt Zohar. The Zohar, we read Matt's translation.
And so I think that's one of the things that gets confusing. People want a simple, straightforward answer to the following question. I'm a Jew, what should I believe? And we don't have such an answer. And in fact, it sort of mystifies me. And again, I'll put my friend Dr. Schall's on the hook and say, I don't know how Christianity and other religious traditions know. I mean, I remember once hearing in a class, as I was talking about this, a woman talking, I think from the catechisms, about a specific sin, giving you 6 hours and 42 minutes of more time in purgatory. Did I misunderstand that, Bill? Or
like you say about Judaism, Mike, there are that is a tradition within Catholicism. It certainly isn't mine.
Okay. Well, that's refreshing to hear. But one of the things I have heard, I believe from you and from others of my Christian friends, that the idea of reincarnation, as distinguished from resurrection, is absolutely inconsistent with Christianity. Is that a fair statement? Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. So this is actually a summary I got from Simcha Raphael, which is helpful. And actually, by the way, I should publicize his institute. It's the Da'at Institute. Da'at is one of the words for knowledge. Institute.net. And he talks about the different dimensions of human being, the afterlife state, the process of afterlife, and the ritual in Judaism. So, he has cards he hands out for this. And I'm sure you'll find the same information on his website. So reincarnation, strictly a Kabbalistic idea.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, but you moved past something that seems that needed to be at least addressed in terms of the Hebrew letters on the left.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Thank you. So God's actual name is Yud He Vav He. So I'm not sure if he's actually associating these letters, I just don't recall, with these particular levels of the soul. And the soul is, since we're going from body, emotion, mind, and spirit, we're going up to higher levels of spirituality here. And I don't recall whether he's associating the letters. But again, for more information about this take, I would absolutely go to his website. He is the man, as far as I'm concerned, on this subject. And actually, we had him out in Ojai and in Ventura as a scholar in residence. And I'm glad, that you, Richard and Janelle, also had a chance to study with him. So on the subject of reincarnation, one of the names for it is Gilgul Neshamot, the turning or the rolling of souls. Strictly a Kabbalistic idea. There's no reference to it in the Bible, Talmudic, or Midrashic literature. It allows one to bring about restitution for sins of prior lives and attain further perfection. So I think here you're seeing the idea of, in this life, I may be paying for sins or undoing sins that I've committed, or even being rewarded for good deeds that I've committed in prior incarnation. Reincarnation is only into human bodies, although there are some minority opinion that the souls of the wicked return as animals. Once again, I imagine there's opinions all over the map, but by and large, it's humans. The custom of naming someone after a deceased relative is based on this idea. And I will have a story from Sonia's family, which is very dramatic about this idea. So the idea being that you had a beloved, let's say, grandmother, and now you have a little girl or even a little boy that is going to be named after grandma or grandpa and have a similar Hebrew name. As does the concept of the Dybbuk. I don't know, there was a play and it was made into a movie, and that you may have come across, a malevolent possession of an evil soul prior to its ascent for divine judgment. In this, very interesting story, a lover dies and inhabits the soul of his fiancée. And even though she's going to get married to some other person, he doesn't want to leave her. And there is concept of Jewish exorcism. And I don't know whether to admit this. I have conducted an exorcism. I had a gentleman who very much loved his wife, and she died, and he was haunted. And I think he meant that literally, by her and by her presence and by her soul. And so I, led him through a ritual. It wasn't a traditional ritual, but I said, we're going to hang up mezuzot in his house, and we're going to tell her that it's okay for her to move on to the next world. And I must say, again, I'm not a Kabbalist, but so I was really trying to work to help him basically let her go. And whether there's any reality to her hanging on to her soul, or whether it was purely a psychological phenomenon, I have no idea. There's also a mystical teaching that all of the souls of all Jews ever born and ever to be born and ever to convert from Judaism were at Sinai. So converts to Judaism, we have this beautiful image that their souls, in fact, were Jewish, and we take them through the conversion process to recognize that they, in fact, were Jewish, but just have never gone through the process, sort of a mystical idea. Okay, so let's see, what time is it? Yeah, a little over an hour. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover tonight. The third session is going to be communication between worlds, near-death experiences, and Jewish mourning practices. And I am going to stop the slideshow and ask if anybody has any questions or comments or.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're going to touch on this next week or not. Another aspect of this engagement of the soul with death, which we talked about a couple of years ago with Simcha Raphael, was the preparation. He was discussing a 3-day period prior to death. Now, not everybody, I guess, gets that luxury, or maybe it's not a luxury. In any case, there is a period of time when the soul is the body ever when you sleep. I mean, that's I think maybe you already discussed, but at least that's a concept in this. Your soul comes back in the morning, but where it goes during that 30-day period is the different part. It goes to Gan Eden. It's preparing to leave the body during that period prior to death. So the time, instead of having your normal dreams, your soul is doing this other work.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Reb Simcha's writing on that subject. Maybe I need to reread his book.
Well, I bring it up because when we took this, and I took this mini course from him, he said he was revising his book, adding additional material to it. So I'm not sure. And so he said, don't buy my book because I'm coming out with a new edition.
Waiting.
So I haven't bought the book. So I'm not sure what's in the latest version now.
Yeah, I know there is a new edition, which he was selling when he was out here visiting us. And I don't know if that material is in that, but I have his older one. Yeah. But I will say, having counseled people who are on their deathbeds and in the process of dying, I will never forget. It was very early in my rabbinic career. In fact, probably before I was ordained. There was a man dying, and I was sitting on his bed, and he said, no, don't sit there. There's an angel or a spirit sitting there. And so I moved over. It's far be it from me. But it is quite common to hear people having visions of the next world, of departed people when they're on their deathbed. And that's pretty much all that I know about that. I don't know about the particular teaching that you have. There is, again, a normative prayer that talks about the idea that actually in the Talmud that sleep is 1/60th of death. It's like a foretaste of death. And in some of the prayers, it talks about how our soul leaves us in the evening when we go to sleep, and God returns it to us every morning. But I'm not familiar with this sort of pre-mortem journey of the soul.
Well, and another variation on this, this is a practice. Maybe I'll talk about this next week. After a person dies, but before the burial, there's this practice of having shomrim, and they read psalms in the presence of the body, keep away spirits. Somehow, I'm not quite sure what the purpose is. I guess maybe I'm turning this into a question. Guard the soul, to guard the soul, to guard the body.
Well, my understanding is the very practical purpose is to guard it against mice and other insects and animals attacking the body in the days before refrigeration and, and hermetically sealing. So it's very practical. And as we'll see next week, the tradition is to bury someone within 24 hours of their passing, unless there's a Jewish holiday in between. So yes, there's something called the shomer, and we'll talk about that next week. And I'm sure there's a spiritual aspect to it, but I'm not that familiar with the spiritual side.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I'm told today that there is communication between the dead and the living that you've mentioned already before, but that it is more typical and more frequent with a person who is recently dead. Is that something you're aware of? Is that something you've heard of?
Okay, so I don't ever recall saying or being aware of the idea that it's more frequent with someone who has recently died.
No, I wasn't suggesting you did. Someone told me that
Oh,
today.
okay, yeah.
You have said that you were aware of situations that seemed evident of communication.
Yes.
From the living.
Yes, and I will be discussing that in 2 weeks.
But in terms of what I just heard today, is that anything you've ever heard, or that's outside of your experience?
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but when I have heard of stories, I would say many of the stories that I hear about, and certainly the ones in my family that I've experienced, and people that I talk to, relate to people who died recently. And again, I would say that would fit the Kabbalistic model that there's a journey from this world to the next. And, there's descriptions of the soul going to and fro in confusion during the period of Shiva, and even more intensely in the first 3 days after passing, from the gravesite to the home, and they don't quite know where they are. In Morocco, there's a very strange tradition that everybody in Morocco knows about, but I've yet to come across one of my teachers who was even aware of it, of covering the grave with the deceased's coat. And this is something that was practiced in Sonia's family. And I've mentioned it to everybody that I run into who is knowledgeable in this subject, and no one's ever even heard about it. So that's a Moroccan mystical tradition. So there's lots of different traditions.
Did you receive that email that I sent you?
Yes, I did. And you can discuss that next week. And
I just want to make sure you received.
Yeah, yes, I did. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Just to make sure it's in 2 weeks, not next
2 weeks.
week.
Yeah, next week, I'm hoping that you will all be celebrating Thanksgiving in whatever custom you are able to do that. And I was talking with the B'nai Mitzvah kids in Bozeman, Montana yesterday about Thanksgiving. And I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, I went to a vegan Thanksgiving at a farm which, rescues animals. And of course we did not have any meat. But one of the more charming aspects of that celebration was just before our meal, we went out to the farm and we fed the turkeys, which I thought, which was good for the soul, I will tell you, irrespective of your attitude toward vegetarianism. Feeding turkeys on Thanksgiving is a good thing to do. I highly recommend it. Restoring balance to the universe. So thank you all for coming, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. And once again, if I can figure out how to stop the video, I am now stopping the video.